The drums beat loudly, and the rhythmic sounds of chanting voices filled the air. The village was alive with movement and joy as men, women, and children danced in celebration. The air was thick with the scent of roasted meats and fragrant herbs, and the evening sun cast a golden glow over the festival. Laughter echoed from every corner, and colorful fabrics swirled in the breeze. Bayo stood at the edge of the crowd, watching with anxious eyes as the people danced. His heart pounded, not from excitement, but from something else. Something heavier. His hands clenched, and his gaze shifted across the festival, searching, waiting. As the dancers twirled and the drummers played, a figure emerged from the shadows. Bayo's eyes locked onto him instantly. The figure moved silently, slipping through the crowd until he was standing right beside Bayo. Without a word, the figure handed him a small, folded note, its edges worn and torn. The symbol on it was familiar, a mark Bayo had seen only once before. He didn't have to read the note to know what it meant. The crowd's laughter grew distant as Bayo stepped away from the festivities, his feet carrying him toward the shadows behind the festival tents. He unfolded the note slowly, the flickering light from the fire casting shadows across his face as his eyes traced the carefully written words. The message was simple but heavy. The deal is in motion. You know what must come next. Bayo's breath caught in his chest. He had made a choice. He had made a deal with Ojo, the powerful trader. The promise of wealth and influence had been too tempting to refuse, and now, the land that had belonged to his family for generations was on the verge of being sold to Ojo in exchange for riches. The thought of his people, his father and his sister, unaware of what was happening, made his stomach twist, but the power that awaited him kept his resolve strong. In the distance, the festival noise faded completely. The crowd's joy seemed like a lifetime away as Bayo stood in the shadows, wrestling with his thoughts. His mind flickered to the land, sacred to his people. A land that gave life and spirit to the village. And now, he was handing it over for gold, a treasure that could never compare to the value of what he was about to lose. There's no turning back now, Bayo muttered to himself. The words settled in his chest like a stone, but he couldn't stop the rush of excitement that followed. Once the deal was done, once Ojo's men arrived to claim the land, he would be powerful. He would no longer be just the son of a respected elder. He would be the one everyone turned to, the one who could shape the village's future. The riches would change everything, make him a leader, and the village would thank him. As his fingers brushed over the note, the writing shifted before his eyes. Your betrayal will come back to haunt you. The cold, jagged letters pierced through his thoughts. He froze. The words seemed to echo in his mind, and for a fleeting moment, doubt crept in. The chill of the message cut through his ambition, but he quickly shoved it aside. Ha! What do they know? Bayo sneered. He shook his head, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that clung to him. I'll be powerful. I'll show them. They'll see me as a leader. They'll thank me when the wealth starts flowing in. But even as the words left his lips, a small voice inside him whispered, You've made your choice. Now face the consequences. The voice was quiet, but it lingered, like a storm waiting to break. He turned, glancing back toward the festival. The lights flickered, the music continued, and the people danced on, oblivious to the storm quietly brewing behind the scenes. He watched them, a grin tugging at the corners of his mouth, but there was something in his eyes, something that betrayed the confidence he tried so hard to project. The joyful sounds of the village, the laughter, the celebration. Everything felt hollow now. As Bayo stood in the shadows, the weight of the note pressed against him like a heavy stone, and the world around him seemed to narrow, closing in. The taste of power was sweet, but in his gut, he knew it was bitter too. The price he was about to pay had yet to be fully understood. The drums continued to beat, but the rhythm felt different now. It was no longer a celebration. It was a countdown. Bayo stood in the shadows, his gaze fixed on the circle of elders gathered before him. The rhythm of their voices flowed like a river, deep and wise, carrying the weight of years, the respect of the land. His father's voice, steady and commanding, held the villagers in rapt attention. He could see the admiration in their eyes, the reverence in the way they leaned toward him, nodding in agreement with every word. But Bayo felt none of that admiration. His stomach twisted. I don't want to be remembered for a name, he muttered to himself, his fists clenched. I want to be remembered for power. His father's wisdom, his strength, meant nothing if it didn't bring control. Ifeoluwa had earned his place among the elders, but Bayo wanted more. He wanted to shape the future, not be stuck in the past. Later that night, Bayo slipped into the dark, silent corners of the village, away from the watchful eyes of his family. The moon barely cast any light as he made his way to the meeting spot. There, a figure waited, his silhouette barely visible in the shadows. Ojo. The trader. The man with enough wealth and influence to change a man's fate. You're late. Ojo's voice was smooth, like the slide of a knife across skin. Bayo nodded but said nothing. Ojo handed him a small bundle wrapped in cloth, money, gems, and a promise. All you have to do is give me the land, Ojo said, his smile sharp, like a wolf's. The power of the village will be yours, and mine. Together, we can rule beyond these borders. Bayo's heart raced, but a shiver of hesitation ran through him. He had always admired Ojo's ability to make things happen. But giving up the land, the sacred land, felt wrong. Yet, the lure of power was stronger. Think of it, Ojo continued, his voice like honey dripping from his lips. We could be kings, both of us. The land will bring wealth beyond what your father can give you. You want power, don't you? This is your chance. The idea was too tempting to ignore. Bayo hesitated no longer. The deal is done, he whispered, sealing his fate with a handshake. Ojo grinned, his eyes cold. As Bayo left the meeting, the weight of his actions settled deep within him. It wasn't just land. It was everything. Days passed, and the secret gnawed at him like a festering wound. Bayo couldn't stop replaying the day he made the deal. The land, the sacred land, he had sold it. He had convinced himself that it didn't matter. It's just land, he whispered over and over. My family won't miss it. I'll bring them more than they've ever dreamed. The day his father had smiled proudly at him, you'll lead this village one day, played in his mind like a song. But Bayo's mind was no longer focused on leadership through respect. It was focused on wealth, on power. His father's trust meant nothing in the face of his own ambition. Ifeoluwa, his father, would never understand. He would never see the potential that Bayo saw. But Bayo kept the mask of respect in place, hiding his betrayal behind words of duty. One evening, Ayatund, his younger sister, noticed his restlessness. Why do you meet with Ojo so often? She asked, her voice soft but filled with concern. Bayo shrugged, pushing the unease away. Don't worry, Ayatund. It's nothing. But Ayatund wasn't fooled. There was a shadow in her eyes, a growing suspicion that something was wrong. She didn't press further, but Bayo could feel her watching him, like a hawk ready to strike. The pressure mounted. Ifeoluwa began to notice too. The once warm, trusting relationship between father and son grew strained. You've become distant, Bayo, Ifeoluwa said one evening, a look of concern in his eyes. What is troubling you? Bayo pushed the words away, brushing them off. Nothing, father. I'm just focused. You'll see soon enough. But inside, Bayo felt the walls closing in. The weight of his secret, of his choices, pressed harder with each passing day. The night was the worst. Alone in his room, Bayo stared at the gifts Ojo had given him, gold, beads, cloth. Wealth beyond his dreams. He ran his fingers over the treasures, the cool metal in his palm feeling like a promise. This is just the beginning, Bayo whispered to himself. Once I have the land, I'll have everything. The thoughts swirled in his mind. Power, wealth, control. He no longer saw the value in loyalty, in family. All that mattered now was what he could grasp. And with Ojo's deal, he could take it all. Then, whispers reached him, whispers from a neighboring village. The land. His land. They had heard about its wealth, and they wanted it. They planned to take it, to claim it as their own. Bayo felt his heart beat faster, fear creeping up his spine. This is the moment, he muttered to Ojo when they met. We need to move fast. If we don't act, everything will fall apart. But Ojo, ever calm, simply nodded. We'll take care of it. The land is yours. Desperation clawed at Bayo's chest as the village elders gathered to discuss the land. Bayo stood before them, trying to sound confident, trying to sell them on his vision. This land is the key to our future, he argued, his voice steady, though his insides churned. "We must act before others take it from us. Think of the prosperity." But his words fell flat. The elders frowned, their trust in him cracking. "Your words don't match your actions," one elder muttered. The village was divided. Some saw the potential Bayo spoke of, but others, led by his father, saw only betrayal. The division deepened. "This land belongs to our ancestors," Ifeoluwa said with a heavy heart. "We cannot let greed take it." Bayo's gaze met his father's, the weight of their differing visions pressing down on him. He wanted to lash out, to argue, to make them understand. "You don't understand, father," he snapped. "I'm doing this for all of us. I'm securing our future." But deep inside, Bayo knew the truth. His thirst for power had cost him more than land, it had cost him the trust of his family. And no matter how hard he tried, he could not erase the damage he had done. The family stood at a crossroads. Bayo had made his choice, and now he had to live with the consequences. Ojo's men appeared suddenly, their boots heavy against the earth, their weapons gleaming under the sun like sharp tongues of flame. The villagers froze, eyes wide with fear, as the men shouted their demand, "Give us what's ours." Their voices were loud and filled with a cold certainty. The calm hum of the village was shattered in an instant, replaced by confusion and anger. Bayo's heart raced as he stood at the edge of the crowd. The deal he thought he controlled had spiraled out of his grasp. This wasn't the smooth, calculated power he had imagined. Ojo's men didn't come to negotiate, they came to take. Panic gripped him. This was not what he had planned. He rushed home, his mind whirling. The family was still gathered in the hut, blissfully unaware of the storm outside. He couldn't let his father know the truth. He had to make them see it his way. "Father, this is our future." Bayo's voice was urgent as he stepped inside. He caught his father's eyes, hoping for understanding. "The land, it's the key. We can build something bigger, something powerful." Ifeoluwa's gaze was firm, unyielding. "I've seen the cost of greed, Bayo. This land is sacred. It cannot be sold." His voice was low, but there was a strength in it that no one could argue with. His words stung, cutting deep into Bayo's chest. But he had made up his mind. "You're wrong, father," Bayo snapped, his anger rising like a storm. "You're too old to see what's coming. The world is changing. I am the future. You failed to see it." Ifeoluwa's eyes softened, but his voice remained calm. "It is you who are blind, my son. This path you walk will destroy us all. Power gained this way is always a curse." Bayo's heart pounded, but he refused to back down. "I'm doing this for us. For the village. You'll see." The tension thickened. Ayatund, who had been quietly watching from the doorway, stepped forward. Her gaze was sharp, full of concern. She had been hearing things, seeing things, that didn't add up. The whispers of Ojo's men, the hurried meetings, the coldness in her brother's eyes. She knew something was wrong. She overheard a conversation late one night, Bayo speaking with Ojo's men, their voices low but filled with malice. The truth began to form like a dark cloud in her mind. "What has Bayo done?" she whispered to herself, dread gnawing at her heart. Her brother, the one who had always protected her, was hiding something terrible. The next day, Ayatund confronted him. "What are you doing, Bayo? What have you promised them?" Her voice shook with fear and determination. She refused to let him destroy everything. Bayo sneered, dismissing her like an annoying fly. "You're too young to understand, Ayatund. Go back to your games." But his words were hollow, and Ayatund wasn't fooled. "I won't let you destroy us," she said, her voice growing louder, desperate. "Tell me the truth." Her brother's eyes flickered with guilt, but he quickly masked it. He turned away. "Just stay out of it, Ayatund. You won't change anything." With no one at home willing to believe her, Ayatund took matters into her own hands. She went to the village elders, clutching the evidence she had gathered. "Bayo has betrayed us," she declared, her voice trembling but resolute. The elders listened, their faces grave as they looked at each other. The weight of her words sank deep into the air. "We must act quickly before it's too late," one elder murmured, his voice filled with worry. As Ayatund spoke, the seed of suspicion began to grow in the village. Whispers spread like wildfire. Bayo's pact with Ojo was no longer a secret. Some villagers, eager for the wealth promised by Ojo, began to voice their support for the trader. Ojo offers us a future, they murmured. What does Bayo offer? The village started to fracture, the people divided by the allure of power and the call for loyalty. The tension was thick, palpable. Bayo, caught in a web of lies, tried to stand tall, but it was no use. His words no longer carried the weight they once had. The villagers who once respected him now eyed him with distrust. You're selling us out, one villager shouted, his voice filled with betrayal. After all we've done for you, this is how you repay us. Bayo's stomach twisted. I am the future of this village, he yelled, trying to hold on to his vision, but it felt hollow. The walls were closing in, and no matter how much he screamed, he couldn't stop the truth from spilling out. He had made his choice, and now the consequences were coming for him. But nothing prepared him for what happened next. Ojo, the very man who had promised him everything, revealed his true nature. You thought you could control this, Bayo? Ojo's laughter echoed like a cold wind. You were nothing but a pawn in my game. The land is mine now, whether you like it or not. Bayo's heart sank as Ojo's men advanced, their eyes cold, their weapons ready. Everything Bayo had hoped for, everything he had worked toward, was slipping through his fingers. He realized too late that he had been nothing more than a tool in Ojo's hands. Ojo's forces descended on the village with brutal force. Villagers scrambled, some trying to resist, others too afraid to move. This is for the future. Ojo's men shouted, pushing their way through, taking what they wanted without hesitation. The chaos was like a storm tearing through the village. Bayo stood frozen, his eyes wide with shock and regret. His betrayal had come full circle. The power he had longed for, the future he had imagined, it had all been a lie. The villagers shouted at him, the ones who had once looked up to him, now full of anger and accusation. But Bayo couldn't respond. He was trapped between his loyalty to Ojo and the people he had once sworn to protect. He had gambled everything, and now, in the midst of the destruction, he realized he had lost it all. I thought this would make me powerful, Bayo whispered, the words escaping his lips like a sigh of defeat. But now I've lost everything. His heart weighed heavy with regret, but it was too late. Ojo's men were in control, and the village, once full of hope and life, was now a shadow of what it had been. The land, the future, everything Bayo had traded for power, was lost. And so, the story of betrayal and ambition came to an end, leaving behind only ruins and the echo of a lost dream. The earth trembled with the arrival of Ojo's men. They stormed through the village, their boots heavy with authority, and their weapons gleamed like the sun itself had hardened them. Give us what's ours, they shouted. The sound of their voices was a thunderclap that silenced every other sound. The villagers froze, their faces etched with confusion and fear. Ojo had come, and his men were ready to claim the sacred land. Bayo stood in the crowd, his heart racing as his stomach twisted. The deal he had made in secret was spiraling out of control. The promise of wealth and power was slipping from his fingers, and he realized with dread that he no longer had control over the situation. Ojo's men were not here to bargain, they were here to take. And in that moment, Bayo knew that he had underestimated the danger of his choices. Desperation gripped him, and he hurried back home, hoping his father might still be swayed, that somehow he could fix this. He found his father in the compound, calm as always, but Bayo could see the wisdom in his eyes turning to stone. Father, this is our future. Bayo pleaded, his voice desperate. You don't understand. If we give them what they want, we will be rich. We'll have power. The whole village will benefit. Ifeoluwa shook his head, his voice firm and unyielding. This land is sacred, he said quietly. I've seen what greed does. The future you dream of will bring nothing but ruin. Bayo's chest tightened. You're old-fashioned, father. Blind to what's coming. You can't hold onto the past forever. The world is changing, and I'm the only one who sees it. Ifeoluwa's eyes never left him. It is you who are blind, my son. This path you walk will destroy everything we have. The words cut deep, but Bayo's anger flared up. You're weak, father. You've failed us all. You don't see the future, I do. The air between them thickened with tension. The sound of their raised voices carried through the village, echoing the fracture growing between them. Ayatund, who had been watching quietly from the doorway, stood frozen. Her brother's words were sharp, full of venom. She knew something was wrong, but the truth was still a shadow in her mind. While their voices clashed, Ayatund's thoughts raced. She overheard Bayo speaking with Ojo's men, their conversation hidden in shadows but filled with promises she couldn't ignore. "What has Bayo done?" she whispered to herself, a shiver running down her spine. The truth, dark and dangerous, was beginning to form in her mind. Her brother wasn't just making a deal, he was betraying the village. Betraying them all. The weight of her discovery pressed on her chest. She couldn't sit by any longer. She confronted him, her voice steady with the strength of someone who would not be silenced. "What are you doing, Bayo? What have you promised them?" Her eyes were filled with disbelief and hurt. She had to know. Bayo turned to face her, a sneer twisting his lips. "You're too young, Ayatund. You don't understand anything. Go back to your games." "I understand enough," she shot back, her voice sharp with determination. "I won't let you destroy us." Bayo's eyes darkened, but he didn't respond. He turned away, his mind already lost in the lies he had built. But Ayatund wasn't finished. She had to act. Without hesitation, she went to the elders, carrying the evidence she had uncovered. "Bayo has betrayed us," she declared, her voice ringing with truth. The elders listened, their faces full of concern. They had trusted Bayo, but the shadow of doubt now hung over him like a storm cloud. "We must act quickly before it's too late," one elder murmured, his voice low with worry. They knew this was no longer a simple matter of negotiation. The balance of the village, its very soul, was at risk. As the village elders discussed what to do, the whispers of Ojo's influence began to spread. People who once followed Bayo's every word were now questioning him. "Ojo offers us a future," some murmured, lured by the promises of wealth. "What does Bayo offer?" The village began to fracture, its unity splintering as people chose sides. Bayo stood at the center, his words once powerful, now hollow. The walls of suspicion began to close in on him. He could feel the villagers turning away, their eyes filled with distrust. "He's selling us out," a villager cried. "After all this time, this is how he repays us." Bayo's heart sank, but he refused to back down. "I am the future of this village," he yelled, trying to hold on to his vision, to the power he had promised. But the words felt weaker, less convincing. The more he fought, the more he realized it was slipping away. His father's warning echoed in his ears, and the faces of the villagers twisted with anger. His lies had caught up with him. But just when Bayo thought he might still salvage something, Ojo's true intentions were revealed. "You thought you could control this, Bayo?" Ojo's laugh rang out, cruel and cold. "You were nothing but a pawn in my game. The land is mine now, whether you like it or not." Bayo's stomach twisted as he watched Ojo's men march forward. They had no need for Bayo anymore. He had been a means to an end, and now they were ready to take what was rightfully theirs. The air exploded with chaos as Ojo's forces stormed the village. The villagers, once hopeful, now scattered in fear. "This is for the future," Ojo's men shouted as they pushed through the crowd, taking what they wanted with brutal force. The sound of destruction filled the air as the very life of the village was ripped away. Bayo stood frozen, torn between the people he had betrayed and the power he had promised to Ojo. His heart pounded, but it was too late. He had already sold his soul, and now he had lost both the land and the trust of his people. The weight of his choices crushed him. "I thought this would make me powerful," he whispered, the regret flooding through him. "But now I've lost everything." His voice broke as the truth settled in. He had lost it all. The land, the future, his people. The village, once full of life and hope, lay in ruin. Ojo's men took control, and Bayo was left standing in the midst of it all, a puppet whose strings had been cut. The dream of power had turned into a nightmare, and all that remained was the echo of his betrayal. Bayo stood before Ojo, his heart racing, his body trembling with fear. The weight of the moment pressed down on him as he opened his mouth, offering everything he had. His family's land, his life, his very soul. "Take it all," Bayo begged. "Just leave my people alone." Ojo laughed, a sound full of cruelty and mockery. "You were never meant to rule," he sneered. "You were always just a pawn in my game." The words hit Bayo like a strike from a heavy club. He stood frozen, the cold truth sinking deep into his chest. He had been played from the start. As Ojo turned away, leaving him empty-handed, the realization crushed Bayo. "What have I done?" he muttered to himself, his voice barely a whisper. His ambition, his hunger for power, had led him straight into the hands of a master manipulator. All of it, his dreams, his betrayal, had been in vain. Then, from the shadows, came a strong voice, filled with authority. "Enough, Bayo." Bayo looked up, his eyes widening. There, standing with unwavering resolve, was his father, Ifeoluwa. The villagers, hidden all around, stepped forward, forming a tight circle of resistance. Bayo's heart pounded, as he felt the strength of his people rising against the man who had deceived them all. "You've sold us out, son," Ifeoluwa continued, his voice unyielding. "But the land will not fall." Ifeoluwa raised his hand, and suddenly, the earth beneath them trembled. Bayo's eyes widened in awe and fear as he watched the ground crack, as though something ancient and powerful stirred within it. "The land is more than just soil, it is our ancestors' spirit," Ifeoluwa explained. The villagers stood in stunned silence as the trees around them shook and the earth itself seemed to come alive, pulsing with a force that no outsider could ever hope to corrupt. Ojo's men shifted uncomfortably, feeling the strange energy in the air. "What is this?" one of Ojo's soldiers asked, his voice shaking with fear. But before anyone could respond, the earth beneath their feet shifted once more, and the villagers, now empowered by the land's magic, began to rise up. With fierce determination, they surged forward, their resolve hardened by the ancestral power that had awakened within the soil. The tide of battle had turned. Ojo's men faltered, retreating before the unstoppable force of the villagers' united strength. Bayo stood torn, his heart warring within him. He looked first at his father's determined face, then at Ojo's retreating figure. The weight of his past choices pressed on him. His mind raced with thoughts of his mistakes, but he knew now that he had to decide who he truly was. "I can't undo my mistakes," Bayo said, his voice heavy with regret. "But I can fight for what's right." His voice grew louder, filled with newfound purpose. "I've failed you all, but I will make it right. Let us fight together." Filled with guilt and shame, Bayo turned to the villagers, his eyes pleading with them. "This is our home. This land is ours," he shouted. "We must defend it, no matter the cost." His words struck deep within the hearts of the people. Slowly, one by one, they stepped forward, rallying to his side. The bonds of family, tradition, and loyalty outweighed any doubts. They would fight together as one. Ojo, enraged by the turn of events, shouted orders to his men. "Crush them. Show them who holds power." His voice rang out, filled with fury. But the villagers, now united with the ancient magic of the land, fought back with a strength that stunned Ojo's forces. The battle raged on, fierce and unrelenting. With every step, Ojo's soldiers were driven back, their confidence shattered by the power of the earth and the courage of those who defended it. Bayo fought at the front lines, leading his people with every ounce of strength he had left. He moved with determination, striking down Ojo's men as they attempted to break through. But the enemy was ruthless, and in the chaos of battle, Bayo was struck, his body falling to the ground. Blood seeped from his wounds, his breath coming in shallow gasps. As he lay there, weakened and struggling, his eyes met his father's. "It's not over," Ifeoluwa said, his voice steady, though filled with concern. His eyes were fixed on the retreating enemy. Bayo tried to rise, pain coursing through him, but his body refused to obey. Still, his will was strong. As the villagers pressed forward, their strength renewed by the power of the land, the magic grew stronger, pushing Ojo's men back. The earth seemed to rise against the invaders, driving them to retreat, step by step. With one final rallying cry, Bayo, despite his injuries, gathered the last of his strength. "For our people," he shouted, his voice hoarse but determined. The villagers surged forward, breaking through Ojo's lines and forcing his men to flee. The battle ended with Ojo's forces retreating in disarray. The sound of their flight echoed across the land, a signal of victory. The villagers stood tall, though many were wounded, their bodies battered but their spirits unbroken. Bayo, exhausted and still bleeding, lay on the ground. The village had been saved, but at a great cost. As the dust of battle settled, Bayo looked around at the people he had wronged, the people who had fought for him, even after all he had done. His eyes lingered on his father, who stood tall beside the others, his strength unwavering. The land that had protected them all now felt different to Bayo, no longer just soil, but something alive, something powerful. Bayo closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of his choices. "I fought for the wrong reasons," he murmured. He looked around again, his heart heavy with the truth. "But I will fight for the right ones from now on." True power, he realized, was not in wealth or influence. It was in unity, in the strength of family and community. It was in the land, the ancestors, and the loyalty of those who stood together through every storm. Bayo had learned the hardest lesson of all. The true power was not in what one could take, but in what one was willing to protect. The battle was over. The land had been defended, and the people had been redeemed. But Bayo knew this was only the beginning. He had learned the true power of the land, and the true strength of his people. And with that, the cycle of struggle and triumph began again, as it always had, and always would. Bayo limped through the village, his body battered and bloodied. Each step felt like a weight upon him, and his heart was heavy with regret. His dreams had crumbled, and the reality of his actions pressed down on him like a stone. As he reached his father and sister, he struggled to find the right words, his voice shaky with emotion. "I've made a terrible mistake," he whispered. "I betrayed you both." Ifeoluwa looked at him, the sorrow in his eyes deep but silent. He said nothing, for there was little to say. Ayatund, his sister, stepped back. She couldn't hide the hurt in her eyes. The love they once had for him was now tainted with distrust. The silence between them stretched, thick with the weight of Bayo's choices. Inside the quiet of their hut, Ifeoluwa spoke, his voice firm yet filled with a quiet pain. "You have lost much, Bayo," he began. "You were given everything, respect, trust, and the future of this village. You threw it all away for power." His words were like a whip across Bayo's heart, each one cutting deeper. "Redemption is not given," Ifeoluwa continued. "It must be earned." The truth hit Bayo hard. He lowered his head, the weight of his father's disappointment pressing on him. He knew Ifeoluwa spoke from a place of deep wisdom, and he accepted the sting of the words. There was no easy way back. Later, when they were alone, Bayo knelt before Ayatund, his voice trembling. "I am so sorry, Ayatund. I was blinded by greed, and I hurt you too." Her face twisted in pain, her eyes filled with unshed tears. "I knew something was wrong," she said softly, "but I didn't know how to stop it. Can you ever fix what you've broken?" Bayo swallowed hard. He could not answer her question. Time, he knew, was the only answer. But he would spend every moment trying to prove himself worthy of her forgiveness. The village was beginning to rebuild, but the air was thick with tension. The people worked, but their eyes followed Bayo with a careful distance. Whispers of his betrayal floated in the breeze, and Bayo could feel the weight of their distrust. His name had become a warning, a cautionary tale for all who dared to seek power at any cost. Still, Bayo stayed. He could not run from the consequences. He stood beside his father, working to restore what had been destroyed. Ifeoluwa said little, but his actions spoke louder than words. Bayo was not given the leadership he had once hoped for, but he was part of the effort to rebuild. It was a hard place to be, but it was his place now. Every day, Bayo worked in silence. He helped to repair homes, to restore the land, and to assist the elders in maintaining the village's traditions. Each task was small, but it was a step, one quiet step at a time, toward regaining the trust that had been lost. Bayo knew that no matter how hard he worked, he could never undo the harm he had caused. But each act of service brought him closer to earning back a piece of the respect he had thrown away. One evening, as the village elders gathered around the fire, Bayo listened closely. "Power is like fire," one elder said, his voice low but firm. "It can warm the heart, but it can also burn everything you love if you aren't careful." The elder's words burned into Bayo's heart. His story had become more than just a tale of ambition. It was a lesson for the entire village about the dangers of betrayal and the consequences of greed. As the sun set, Bayo sat beside his father, their faces shadowed in the flickering light. He had to ask the question, though it twisted in his gut. "Father, will you ever trust me again?" Ifeoluwa looked at him with eyes that held both sorrow and hope. "I trust that you have learned," he said quietly. "But trust is built over time. You must earn it, Bayo. The village will see your actions. In time, they may believe in you again." The village was changing. It would never be the same, but it was beginning to thrive once more. The land, strong and steady, protected them. The people began to heal, though the scars of betrayal would never fully fade. Bayo's role was no longer as the leader he had once hoped to be. He was now a humble servant, working alongside his father and the people, ensuring that the village would never again fall victim to the ambitions of one man. And so, time passed. Bayo's legacy, though not the one he had once imagined, lived on in the quiet acts of service he performed. He would never lead again, but his willingness to rebuild, to restore what he had broken, became a symbol of redemption. His story would be remembered not just as a tale of ambition, but as a lesson in humility, in the dangers of seeking power at any cost. As the elders told the story around the fire, they spoke of how Bayo's ambition nearly destroyed the village. But they also spoke of the lesson his life taught: redemption is not a gift. It is earned through hard work, humility, and a willingness to restore what has been lost. The village thrived once more, but Bayo's name would forever carry the weight of that lesson. Bayo walked slowly along the edge of the land, his feet pressing into the soil he had nearly given away. The earth beneath him felt heavy, as though it carried the weight of his mistake. He paused, staring out across the village that had once been his to lead, the village that had nearly slipped through his fingers. A deep, bitter regret filled his heart. "I almost gave this all away," he whispered to himself, the realization of how close he came to losing everything sinking deep within him. For a moment, he stood still, his mind wrestling with the choices he had made. The land, once just a symbol of power, now felt like something entirely different. A reminder of his failures, his greed, and the betrayal that had almost cost him everything. Then, something inside him shifted. He looked to the horizon, where the village stood strong, its people rebuilding, its spirit unbroken. The thought hit him with the force of a thunderclap. Power isn't in gold or titles. It's in loyalty, in standing with your family and your people. He felt the weight of those words. In that moment, Bayo understood something deeper. Power was not in what one could hold or own. It was in the trust, the bond, the loyalty shared between those who loved and supported you. His eyes turned toward the hut where his father and sister sat. It was not riches nor land that made a man wealthy. It was the love and respect of those who truly mattered. His true wealth had always been here with them. He had been blind to it, but now the truth was as clear as the sky above. With a deep breath, Bayo began walking back to his family, his steps slower now, each one carrying the weight of newfound understanding. He looked at his father and sister sitting together, their bond unbroken despite the storm they had weathered. In that moment, he understood what had always been passed down through the generations. Not land or gold, but wisdom and unity. This was the inheritance that truly mattered. The true power had never been his ambition or the riches he sought. It had always been in the unity of his people, in the love that held them together. When Bayo reached them, he stopped, standing in silence before his father and sister. There were no words now that could fix the past, no phrases that could undo the hurt. His apology had no voice, just a quiet lowering of his head, a silent gesture of humility and regret. His father lifted his eyes to him, a small nod acknowledging the unspoken understanding between them. Bayo didn't need to say anything. The lesson had been learned. He had discovered the most valuable truth of all. Bayo sat down beside his father. The land stretched out before them, no longer a symbol of what he had lost, but a symbol of what he had earned. It was not wealth that would make him a leader. It was his commitment to rebuilding trust, to honoring his roots, and to standing by his family. The path ahead was clear now. It would be a path of loyalty, family, and respect. The journey would not be easy, but Bayo was ready to walk it. He took a deep breath, feeling the earth beneath him as a new strength surged within him. The past was behind him, and the future, though uncertain, held the promise of redemption earned through humility, hard work, and a willingness to protect what truly mattered. Bayo was ready to lead, not through titles or power, but through the bonds of loyalty that would guide him forward.